When you think of characters that were done just downright wrong in fiction, Casca should be on the top of your list. When she was introduced in Berserk, she felt more like a simp than a shield maiden, but gradually, as the story progressed, so did her character, and about 20 chapters into the main storyline, we were completely on board with her. Rarely do we get to see a female warrior character toe that near-invisible line of being strong yet feminine, and Kentaro Miura managed to pull that off so well with her character that he ended up giving her generational trauma to make up for it. There is no character that has been exposed to the true horrors of the world of Berserk like Casca, to the point she literally lost her mind for around 2 odd years. And even when she got it back, it was only for, as pro wrestlers would say, a cup of coffee. Her life has been defined by hardship and tragedy since the very beginning, and we're here to give you an idea of just how bad things really got for her. This is every horrible thing that has happened to Casca in Berserk, explored. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means an awful lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Casca was born in an impoverished, war-torn borderland. The conditions of a person's birth have a massive influence on the quality of their life, and while many characters in Berserk were born in misery, Casca seemed to have drawn the shortest possible end of that stick. She was born in a village nestled in a mountain ravine whose land was so barren that all they could grow on it was oats. Her family did what they could to till the land and scrape together a living, but poverty was the norm for the people of her village. Even though their lands were practically barren, their feudal overlords would bleed them to death with taxes. And if that didn't do the job, the constant hunger would. Going 3 days without any food was commonplace for Casca, and just to put the cherry on top of a terrible cake, her village was located at a border region. If you know anything about warfare, then you'll know that the borderlands are the first ones to get hit during any conflict, and their fates are usually the worst. Casca and her family were used to hiding out in the mountains whenever their village was attacked, and all they could do was watch as their homes and fields were looted and burnt. These were the conditions under which Casca grew up, and while we agree that the medieval times were harsh, her formative years were especially cruel to her. She grew up in constant hunger and fear of being attacked, or worse, and turns out she had good reasons for feeling that way. Casca was sold to a nobleman because she was a burden. This sounds like an outrageous thing to do in the modern era, doesn't it? Sadly, it was common practice in the Middle Ages, and Casca was one of those burdens. She was the youngest child in a family of 8, with 5 older siblings, and despite having such harsh living conditions, all of them had somehow made it to adolescence. It's depressing to think that letting your kids actually live their life can be a bad thing for them, but that was the unfortunate truth for Casca's family. Casca used to work in the field, just like everyone else, and she did all she could to ease her family's burden, but she couldn't help them the way they needed it. So when a passing nobleman saw her pushing a cart in the fields, he made her family an offer. He would take Casca on as a castle maid. The man offered Casca's father money that would have kept his family alive for a decent while. And though she says he was reluctant in accepting it, it is even more depressing to know that in her later years, Casca deemed the move to be practical. Berserk is a story where many characters are either orphans or terribly estranged from their parents. Guts and Griffith fall in the former category, while Farnace falls in the latter. Casca is one of the few characters who is shown to have grown up in what can be thought of as normal family setup, complete with multiple siblings and everything. But as we said earlier, the conditions of a person's birth influences their quality of life, and Casca had always been handed a raw deal in that regard. Though she understood why her parents did what they did, it didn't change the fact that they sold her anyways, and besides, she couldn't go back even if she wanted to, because Casca was nearly assaulted by the same nobleman before being rescued by Griffith. If you're one of those people who also found it weird that someone of peerage would decide to give Casca a job just by watching her cart-pushing skills, then congratulations, your predator sense is on point. At the time, it wasn't entirely evident to her because she was still reeling from the fact that her family had literally sold her out, but with the power of retrospect, even Casca could see just how sus the nobleman's pretext for acquiring her services was. No sooner had they made it out of the village's borders than he tried to force himself on her within his carriage. Casca instinctively fought back and scrambled away from him, trying to dash through those familiar fields to safety, but she was 12 and terrified. He was a grown adult male. At the time, she thought it was only natural that this would be happening to her. Life was getting stomped on and being rolled over for folks like her. This thought process kept her grounded in reality in her mind. Casca had given in to her terrible fate and would have likely been introduced to it too, had her lord and savior not shown up to rescue her. Just as it seemed like the nobleman would violate her and take her with him, Griffith arrived on the scene. slicing the dude's ear off and throwing the sword at Casca's feet. Instead of directly saving her himself, he empowered her to do it by encouraging her to fight for what she wants to protect. Casca ended up killing her first man at the age of 12, and the only thing that stopped her from shaking after was Griffith's reassuring arm. Though the incident did have a somewhat happy ending, let's just put things into perspective here. Casca was sold by her family, nearly assaulted, then forced to defend herself as a means of empowerment, and also acknowledged the fact that going back home would only get her folks in trouble. Because how in the heck did a 12-year-old farm girl manage to get away from a rich and powerful nobleman? So, the only practical option in her head was to, drumrolls please, join a band of mercenaries. Does this not sound insanely pragmatic for a 12-year-old girl? If your answer is yes, then you know why this is so sad. She was forced to make mature life decisions at a very young age, and as a consequence, she ended up suppressing her actual emotions, which was only bad for her because Casca was forced to accept that her love would always be one-sided. In her time as a member of the Band of the Falcon, Casca had come to borderline worship Griffith. She would follow his commands without question and trained herself to the brink of insanity to become the second best swordsman in the entire band. She adapted to the way of the mercenary very well, even as a woman, and it was all because, well, she basically loved Griffith. Casca didn't know this at the time, but she wanted to become the sword with which he accomplished his dream because she was madly in love with Griffith, to the point that everyone in the band basically knew it, and she couldn't stand the fact that Griffith was giving his attention to Guts willingly when he joined up with the Falcons. Casca was a practical woman. She knew that in order to achieve his impossible dream, Griffith was going to have to take some impossible risks. It was because she understood the sheer scope of what he was trying to achieve that she accepted his involvement with unsavory figures like Genon once he explained it. But, on the contrary, that also isolated her from him emotionally. Casca knew that the easiest way to become king for Griffith would be to marry the Princess of Midland and dispose of her parents discreetly. She had no illusions about the fact that the White Falcon would put the moves on Princess Charlotte once he got an in, because that would be the best possible course of action for achieving his dreams. But that doesn't invalidate her emotions. Casca would later admit to Guts that watching Griffith involve himself with Charlotte, and even Guts, just burns her up from the inside because they have something she doesn't, and that is Griffith's attention. It eats her alive that though she has his trust, she doesn't have his unrequited attention, and to make things worse, the only person she had ever admitted this to was Guts, though in her defense, it was highly circumstantial because that time Casca suffered from menstrual fever mid-battle. Any time a physical ailment on the morning of a major battle can spell disaster for you, but most things can be avoided if you keep your nose clean. Casca was hit with an inherently unavoidable problem right before the penultimate battle of the 100-Year War, and no amount of healthy living could have helped her skirt around it. That's because right before the battle began, Casca realized that her menstrual cycle was beginning, and during the course of the battle, she developed a fever as a consequence. A man does not have to worry about such things when he goes out to fight because his innate physiology doesn't require him to bleed for a few days once a month. Despite honing her skills to the point where she could take on most men and win against them in a sword fight, Casca had no control over her physiology, and this was a constant source of agony for her. The fever clearly affected her battle prowess. She was panting way faster than usual and seemed pretty out of it for the most part. If she wasn't as skilled as she was, one unchecked blow from a two-door knight could have ended her life right there. Or even worse, open her up to the sickening horrors of war that women are frequently subjected to in the world of Berserk. But physical damage wasn't the only thing that Casca was going to have to deal with in this encounter because Adon Cobberwaltz. After going through a couple of two-door men, Casca was confronted by the leader of the Blue Whale Knights, a goofy bull of a man known as Adon Cobberwaltz. Now usually, Miura-sensei's characters have intricate layers and emotional backstories so you could find reasons to like villains too. If you do enough mental gymnastics, Adon was a caricature of literally everything bad about a man. He taunted Casca into fighting him by implying she slept her way to the top of the command chain, and threatened to give her over to his men for their nightly entertainment on more than one occasion. Usually, Casca could shut him up in an instant by defeating him in a duel, but like we mentioned earlier, on this particular occasion her body had betrayed her. Casca already had many insecurities about being a woman in a mercenary band, and harboring feelings for the man who was her leader, so it makes sense that she'd be angry with herself for something that is natural for her body to go through. And when she came face to face with Adon Cobberwaltz, all those insecurities were reinforced by his vile accusations, which managed to make Casca lose sight of the true objective. And, in battle, that's enough to ensure your defeat. For all his distasteful takes on gender and warfare in general, Adon was a strong man who wielded a trident like it was a spear. He cornered Casca pretty easily in their first encounter and would have killed her had Guts not arrived to save her. Their second encounter wasn't any better, as Casca was still recovering from her weakened state and Adon had brought with him 100 Tudor knights. She once again couldn't keep up for too long and was forced to flee the scene. Adon sent some of his trackers after her to capture her and break her in, and if Judo hadn't reached her just in time, there's no telling what would have happened to Casca here. Thankfully, Miura-sensei gave us sweet retribution in the final battle of Doldry, where a fully recovered Casca humbled Adon and turned him into one of her simps instead. She was motivated by every horrible thing that the Tudor nobleman had threatened to do to her and nearly done to her, so it was so satisfying to see Copperwaltz lose once and for all. But Adon's taunts don't hold a candle against what Casca nearly suffered at the hands of a certain Black Dog Knight. Casca was forced to lead the Band of the Falcon for a whole year, well, on the run. You know, given that she was still reeling from the departure of the man she loves and the complete spiral that the man she admired had fallen into, this is more of a miracle than a nightmare. But if you saw Casca at the end of that year, you'd understand why this entry is on our list. When Griffith decided to seduce Princess Charlotte in order to regain some measure of control over his own ambitions following Guts' departure, he doomed his entire army, because technically, what he did was treasonous. But none of the Falcons knew that Griffith had gone so far off the rails because of Guts leaving that he ended up committing naked treason, and so they didn't suspect anything was off when they were summoned to the grounds outside of Wyndham early in the morning, without armor, and practically weaponless as well. Pippin was the first to understand the trap they'd fallen into when Griffith failed to show his face, and despite being in the pits of her despair, Casca was the only one who stepped up to the plate and became the Falcons' leader. She led them out of that ambush and into the countryside of Midland, where thanks to her insanely efficient leadership, the Falcons managed to survive a year on the run. The reason we call this feat insane is because the King of Midland had pledged nearly a fourth of his standing armies into hunting down the Band of the Falcon once he discovered what Griffith had done, and Casca fended off nearly 80% of Midland's forces with no preparation or prior warning. The reason this is horrific, however, is because while she was too busy making sure everyone else had survived, it was all she herself was living for now. Casca was too tired and too depressed to think about herself because when she did, she'd break down into tears. When her party was attacked by Salat and his mercenaries, she managed to keep up with the young master of the Bakiraka for a bit, but because she had neglected having her meal and was just generally too emotionally unstable, she almost lost her head to his blades. When Guts showed up and saved her life, her first response was to try to kill him, and her second response was to try to kill herself. The pressure of leading so many men on the run from what was essentially a world power, all the while reconciling the fact that it was probably because the guy you loved porked princess you wanted, can at the very least get to a person. It's downright heartbreaking to watch Casca just give up and fall into a nearby waterfall. Though Guts notes that nothing good ever comes out of Casca's proximity to water bodies, we as readers know it goes much deeper than that. Honestly, the only thing that probably kept her going even after being this burnt out was the fact that she finally had a plan and the means to rescue Griffith, but as she was about to find out, to her horror, that wasn't exactly a good idea to begin with. Wyald. Despite being on the run for a year and having her back blown out by the strongest human in the entire series without a question, Casca was surprisingly healthy enough to orchestrate an elaborate escape plan for Griffith. It went off without a hitch as well, if nearly getting crossbowed to death by Midland Knights and or killed by highly trained Bakiraka assassins is your definition of success. The real problem for the Griffith rescue team reared its head after they had left the borders of Wyndham City, because their scent was picked up by the maddest dog in all of Berserk, Wyald. The leader of the Black Dog Knights was known for being a disreputable brute who only focused on indulging his id as much as he could, but there was another reason for his savage existence. Wyald, you see, was an apostle, and to be honest with you guys, he is the definition of a hedonistic, demonic being in a human skin. His motto of enjoying and exciting makes those two positive words lose all their meaning once you see what his idea of fun entails, and horrifyingly enough for Casca, she was nearly introduced to a practical application of said philosophy. When Wyald caught up with the Band of the Falcon, he turned on his men, whom he deemed to be cowards, and assumed his apostle form to engage Casca's men. The initial exchange between them went about as well as the encounter between the Falcons and Nosferatu Zod, and Wyald had already taken care of Guts at this point by hurling a literal tree at him. Casca tried to slap him awake, but it was too late. The ape apostle had spotted his next prey. What happens next is basically why you have never heard of or seen this dude in any of Berserk's anime adaptations. Because his release state didn't allow him to use his, well, regular phallus, Wyald pulled out another from his secondary mouth, which was thorny like a cactus. It nearly traumatized us just to look at it, so we can't imagine what Casca must have felt like to have to grapple with the fact that she might get violated by it. Thankfully, Guts wakes up with a busted lip and a clear head due to Casca's slaps and intervenes just in time to save her from that horrible fate. But to us, damage had already been done, and then expounded upon when Wyald also undressed and exposed Griffith to his fellow Falcons. The ape apostle was killed by one of his own kind in the end, ironically enough, and while Casca was relieved to be safe from monsters like him, little did she know that all of that was just a preview to the rest of her life. That time, Casca's hero and idol tried to force himself on her. Man, our girl just cannot seem to catch a break for the life of her, can she? And this, coming right after she survived yet another attempted assault scenario, just feels even more disgusting. But what takes it to truly disturbing territory is the person who does it, because Casca had spent most of her life until this point worshipping Griffith. But now that she saw just how powerless he was in the face of his year-long torture, he couldn't take her pity. Not one bit. Casca had been shocked by Griffith's appearance when she first saw him in the Tower of Rebirth. Her shock had turned into a chilling sense of despair, as the torturer explained all the horrible things he had done to her leader, and then it settled into a sort of tranquil sense of acceptance that this was how things were going to have to be from here on out. But Griffith, who had just endured an entire year of mind-breaking torture, who had lost all of the things that could help accomplish his dreams due to one impulsive decision, only saw Casca as yet another thing slipping out of his grasp. The Tower of Rebirth's jailer took Griffith's tongue in the course of his year-long residency in the tower's bowels, but Kentaro Miura wasn't an artist who needed words to convey emotions through his characters. Every close-up we get of Griffith following his escape from the Tower of Rebirth shows him glaring at Guts and Casca's newfound closeness and putting two and two together by the time Wyald ended up exposing him. So when Casca was chasing his bandages in the aftermath of that horror show, he decided to give her one of his own making. Griffith, whose wrists and feet were useless thanks to the torture he had endured, forced himself upon Casca and started aggressively trying to assault her. Casca was stunned initially, but seeing his broken face made her pity the man she loved, and she ended up comforting him instead. It was only after she left the carriage that she broke down in tears because of what had just happened, and yet Casca couldn't bring herself to leave Griffith. When Guts showed up following a conversation with Judo, he immediately sensed something had happened to Casca and demanded answers. Casca refused to tell him that Griffith had just tried to force himself on her, instead telling him that she needed to take care of Griffith in his desperate hour of need. She told Guts they needed to split up, and this is the moment where we realize she has something akin to Stockholm Syndrome when it comes to Griffith. This isn't the first time that Griffith has subjected her to something misogynistic, as during her first encounter with Guts, he forced her to sleep naked with him and ensure his survival. Not because it would save his life, but because it was a woman's job. Casca felt like she owed her life to Griffith, and that is why she followed him around blindly. Never in a million years would she have thought that he would treat her like this, but to be honest, that's who the real Griffith has always been. He views his supposed comrades as nothing more than tools, sleeps with sleazy old men for their money, seduces a princess, and kills a queen, all to ensure that he alone will reign supreme in the end. In the moment that Griffith thrust himself onto Casca, he shattered that veil of worship she had over her eyes, and it shook her to her very core. She couldn't even admit to Guts that the guy he was worried something had happened to was the one he should technically be murking, but she wouldn't have to wait too long for that to happen. Guts would eventually get around to naming Griffith public enemy number 1 on his personal hit list, but it would happen in a way that no one could have expected, least of all, Casca. The Eclipse. Perhaps the single most traumatizing event in all of Berserk because of how unexpected and morally disgusting it was, the Eclipse saw the entire band of the Falcon be branded with a terrible fate. When Griffith reaffirmed his resolution in his dream and decided to sacrifice his comrades to make it happen, we saw his real face. But we don't think Casca quite understood what was happening. That isn't because she was blissfully unaware or ignorant of her circumstances, however. It was actually the opposite. Casca had been leading the band in Griffith's absence presence for an entire year. It was because of her leadership that they had survived persecution from the Midland Regular Army and were able to actually rescue Griffith. She was not about to give up on her men, even though they had all been sucked into a weird dimension covered with faces from the sky to the earth with only a black sun left to illuminate that hellscape. Casca's first reaction to being pulled into the interstice was to scream at her men to form up. She sensed their instinctive fear given the situation, but kept a calm head herself and gave them possibly the best advice they could have received at the time. In a battle, knowing your enemy is important, but it's a double-edged sword. If you think too much about an enemy's strengths or their disconcerting appearance, your mind sort of forgets to even stick to the basics. Casca knew that if her men broke once, it would be impossible to get them to form up again. What she didn't know was that none of that mattered, because there wasn't going to be a fight. It would be a unilateral slaughter. Casca was just as baffled as the rest of the Falcons when Void claimed that Griffith was the honorable child for whom this eclipse had been convened. And when Conrad lifted up Guts and Griffith to the latter's altar, all she could do was take their names. She was so stunned by her former leader's decision to give over his men, her included, to demonkind, that she couldn't even fathom why all this was happening to them. The Invocation of Doom never brands its target at a specific location. Every Falcon that was branded in Griffith's Eclipse received the brand of sacrifice at different locations. Judo got it on his palm, Pippin on his forearm, and Corcus on his forehead. We don't know if it was dramatic irony or causality that made Miura put Casca's brand of sacrifice right over her heart, but it is extremely fitting considering everything that we've told you about her thoughts and feelings for Griffith. For most of her life, that is. After hearing that speech from Void and seeing what happened next, Casca questioned whether their sins had piled up so high that they were being devoured by literal demons, or if this was the nightmare that Griffith had always wanted. In her dazed state, she didn't notice the apostles closing in on her until it was too late, and when Pippin and Judo intervened, all she could do was let them help her survive. She saw the two men who had been closest to her out of the entire band of the Falcon die horrible deaths, but that was frankly nothing compared to the fate that awaited her. Casca managed to cut down the apostle who killed Judo and promised him that she would continue to struggle and survive as the leader of the Falcons, just how Guts would. But one dead demon was all she could manage. Soon enough, she was surrounded by apostles hungry for her flesh, and something else as well. If these monsters had been coming at her one at a time, there could have been a way for Casca to fight and survive until the eclipse broke. But this is Berserk, and in Berserk, things have a knack for getting worse just when it feels like they can't. Casca's armor is ripped off and her clothing is slashed all across her body. The apostles wanted to gorge themselves on this delicious sacrifice, but they were going to have their fun with her first. We like to think that Guts' rampage after he saw what Casca was in for is Miura's way of representing all the things that his leading lady wanted to do but couldn't, because Casca was in a truly helpless situation. Before this point, every time she had gotten into a situation that threatened her sexual integrity, luck or causality would intervene and send someone to protect her. This time she knew everyone else was dead and that Guts stood alone, which is probably why she kinda just gives up. Casca was prepared for death when the apostles picked her up, and even though she was faced with a terrible fate before that, at least the surety of death gave her some kind of peace. In that moment, the worst possible thing that could happen to her was that she'd somehow end up surviving this literal demonic abuse. And of course, because this is Berserk, that's exactly what happens. The very man who saved Casca from a terrible fate was now inflicting it upon her. Casca's introduction to Griffith was perhaps the most White Knight-esque encounter in all of Berserk. He showed up when she was at her most helpless, and instead of just saving her from a cruel fate, he empowered her to take her destiny in her own hands. Griffith was the one who gave her the sword that changed her life, made her feel powerful and in control, and the one who had her undying love and attention for it. Though Casca probably resisted it in her initial years as a Falcon, by the time she neared proper adulthood, she couldn't deny her feelings for Griffith any longer. This is why it was so shocking and traumatic for her when he tried to force himself on her, even in his crippled, invalid state. Little did Casca know that even that was a preview of the literal nightmare that was waiting for her in the Eclipse. After Femto's birth, every apostle in the interstice went dead silent and dropped their gaze in honor of the fifth Demon King. In the world of demons, the God Hand were at the top of the pecking order, and apostles were nothing more than extensions of their will. It made sense that after essentially becoming their master, that Griffith would be respected in such a way. What didn't make sense was the heinous act he chose to perform as his first deed as a god hand, because it was so inherently disgusting and crude that it is rightly thought of as one of the worst acts in all of manga, period. Griffith, reborn as a demonic entity called Femto, whose heart was frozen and who no longer felt emotions, chose to crush the remnants of his past self by violating its only remaining connection, Casca. We don't want to dwell on this for too long because YouTube might delete our channel for showing some of these panels, but it was a literal gut punch when we realized Femto's objective with Casca as we were reading chapter 86 of Berserk. And what makes it even worse is the fact that to him, this was an act that established his dominance over Guts. Casca just happened to be collateral. The entire time that Femto was violating his former second-in-command, he kept looking at Guts, and when the latter tried to charge at him, Femto had him restrained, so he was forced to watch. And while all this was going on, the only sentence Casca managed to get out of her mouth was a plea for Guts to not watch. Even in a situation that is arguably worse than being eaten alive by an apostle, Casca didn't want Guts to be traumatized because she knew his traumas with sexual assault and the like. Unfortunately, she should have just worried about herself because that was the last time we would hear Casca speak for over 2 years. Casca's mind breaks due to the trauma of the Eclipse. Imagine being saved by a person at the age of 12, spending your whole life idolizing them for it, only to be subjected to the same fate you were saved from all that time ago by the very person who did the saving. It makes sense that Casca's mind would break following the literal nightmare of the Eclipse, but that still didn't make it any less impactful. There were hints that Casca was going to go insane all throughout the Eclipse, like her rejecting her current situation, her begging Judo to get up and fight, and her falling dead silent after being taken by the apostles. But the full extent of this mental break was revealed to us in chapter 89, and to say it was one of the saddest and most tragic revelations in all of Berserk would be an understatement. We were Guts in that moment when we realized that the love of his life was no longer the person he used to know. See, Guts was able to retain a shred of his own sanity and sense of self because death and violence was his whole life. And besides, he was now motivated by a blinding rage towards Griffith, which made him stand on his own 2 feet and think with his own mind. Casca, for all her fighting skills and leadership qualities, wasn't an inherent struggler. Her goals as a falcon and a fighter were entirely different from Guts's, and so when the Eclipse happened, despite giving an impeccable first response to it, her subsequent actions were tinged with a dreadful sense of impending doom. She had nearly given up on life multiple times even before the Eclipse, and she might as well have done so in its aftermath. That moment where Casca is mindlessly bathing in a waterfall, unable to recognize Guts or even Rickert, whom she had come up with in the Band of the Falcon, was heartbreaking for us. The only things she could interact with normally now were birds, animals, children, and women who gave off a harmless vibe to her regressed brain. For over 2 years, Casca was forced to live in a mine because that was the only place she could be safe. She was repulsed by the very sight of Guts because he reminded her of the Eclipse and all the horrors her mind had tried to bury within its deepest recesses. Casca was, in a word, helpless, and that is downright terrifying considering, well, she was with child right before the Eclipse. The birth of Casca's demon child. The birth of a child is a mother's greatest joy, but the process that gets her there sounds like an excruciating nightmare. Before we were blessed with surgical advancements and things like a C-section, women gave birth the old-fashioned way, and it was painful enough if you were in your right mind. Casca's mind was in fragments when she gave birth, and to make things worse, she didn't even know she was pregnant. When Guts and Casca affirmed their love for one another, they inadvertently ended up planting the seed of a new life in Casca's womb. When Femto violated that womb, his demonic seed corrupted the fetus within and caused it to mature very rapidly. What would have taken 9 months took hardly a few weeks, as Casca ended up giving birth 4 days after the Eclipse, which itself was only a few days removed from her encounter with Guts in the forest. While the Black Swordsman struggled with his new reality as a resident of the Interstice and a branded individual, Casca was curiously spared a similar fate. After Guts caught up with his lover following her escape from the mine, he noticed that the malign spirits of the dead were swarming around her, but not attacking her. He rushed to help regardless, and asked a mindless Casca if she was hurt or harmed in any other way. But just as he shook her, Casca went into labor. After a few short moments spent in excruciating pain, a tiny fetus fell out of Casca's womb, and to all of our collective shocks, it was the same baby that was haunting Guts in the Black Swordsman arc. Back then, Miura must not have had a clear idea as to what he was going to do with the demon child, because he appeared in Guts' nightmares and told him that he couldn't escape from them, implying that it too was a part of his daily agony. But by the time he had reached the Eclipse, he must have figured out how he wanted to incorporate that misshapen baby into his story, because he decided to make Guts and Casca its parents. Guts, who was extremely torn by the knowledge that his child was now technically a part of the same race he had vowed to exterminate, tried to commit infanticide immediately after realizing what he had created, but Casca wouldn't let him. Though her mind was broken and she couldn't even eat food properly by herself, Casca's motherly instinct for the child born from her flesh was too strong. She protected the demon child from Guts, and would continue to treat it like her own baby on the night of every full moon when it appeared in front of her. The fact that Casca gave birth the way she did, and that she went out of her way to protect her child, feels like a sign of strength. But if you just take a step back and really think about the circumstances it all occurred in, you realize this is perhaps more disturbing than entire franchises of horror movies. That time, Casca ended up accidentally becoming a cult's figurehead witch. This entry feels like a joke, but it isn't. After spending 2 years hunting down apostles and caring for nothing besides his war against the Inhumans, Guts returned to Godot's cave, only to find Casca missing. The branded girl had escaped her sanctuary, and somehow ended up in the holy city of St. Albion, where she was taken in by Berserk's best girl, Luca. Luca took Casca in, gave her the alias of Elaine, and covered her face to protect her from the Inquisitors gathered around the city. When people would ask her who she was, Luca would claim Elaine was her sister who contracted syphilis on the job and was now on the verge of insanity. For a total stranger and the leader of a prostitute circle besides, you'd think that Luca would jump at the first chance to pimp out a mindless work-fit girl like Casca, but this is the side of Berserk that seems to go unnoticed all the time, where men and women break the mold of their stereotypes and show the world that good, decent people still exist despite their personal struggles. However, as we've told you before, Berserk is the embodiment of the phrase, "and then things got worse." And if a genuinely good character is introduced to the story by Miura-sensei, then you better prepare for things to get a whole lot worse. One of the prostitutes in Luca's circle, Nina, who is arguably the most reviled character in the Berserk fandom, inadvertently exposed Casca to her heretical cult of the Flame Goddess, with the Flame Goddess being none other than the god hand Slan. And once her brand of sacrifice worked its magic in the heretic's presence, those mindless sinners saw her as a representative sent to them by their evil god. Casca ended up getting kidnapped by the cult, who appointed her as their witch and threw a sacrilegious cave party for her acceptance, where the opening match would be Nina getting sacrificed, and the main event would see their great goat mingle with Casca. All of this was extremely unsettling to say the least, and to be honest with you, we're sort of glad that Casca was mindless in this instance, because at least that shielded her from realizing what was actually happening to her. Every time Casca was nearly assaulted by the monsters and men of Berserk. But speaking of Casca mingling with the Great Goat, one of the biggest themes of Casca's life seems to be the constant threat of sexual violence that she's under. Her life as a mercenary began when she defended herself from it, and over the course of 40 volumes, Casca has been forced to do the same thing at least half a dozen times, both from monsters and men. She was nearly violated by Adon Cobberwaltz's men before Judo saved her. Wyald almost introduced her to his slaying and laying club, and we've already told you what happened to her during the Eclipse. But even after that infernal nocturnal feast was concluded, Casca wasn't safe from becoming prey. If anything, she was now more susceptible to it. Before the heretics from Nina's cult decided to worship her as a witch, they very nearly assaulted her. It's bitter irony that the brand of sacrifice is what ended up protecting her in that moment, as well as her demon child. Even after surviving the incarnation ceremony and being reunited with Guts, she wasn't safe from this recurring motif, as Casca was nearly assaulted by a few thugs who happened upon her during her travels with the Black Swordsman. In that final instant, her innate fighting instincts kicked in, and she was able to protect herself, but it paved the path for a different kind of psychological horror to take grip of her mind. Needless to say, each of these encounters affected Casca's mental and emotional state greatly, but they weren't nearly as incendiary as what almost happened to her in St. Albion, and we do mean that quite literally. That time, Casca was nearly burnt at the stake. The arrival of Casca and Guts on the holy ground of St. Albion, where blind sheep gathered in preparation for the incarnation ceremony, was preordained by causality, but the foreshadowing for Casca's burning was done by her demon child himself. Once Casca was captured by Mozgus and his inquisitors, the countdown to burndown began. She was protected from the blood flow of the dead, which consumed the Tower of Conviction by her demon child, but the baby could only keep up with that endless tide of malice for so long. When the demon child's power ran out, Casca was taken by Mozgus himself, who had now been transformed into a pseudo-apostle by the egg of the perfect world. Mozgus, a fanatic who had already judged Casca to be a witch associated with Nina's cult, decided to burn her at the stake, which fulfilled the second part of that prophecy we mentioned at the start of this entry. When the branded pair arrives on that holy ground, a pillar of flame will be erected, which will signal the beginning of the end for the world of reason. And if you paid attention to the title of the entry itself, you know where we're going with this. The only reason Casca survived this stake burning is because of Isidro, who decided to bungee jump himself all the way to her prospective funeral pyre and bring her back up to the tower for a taste at redemption. Had Dropi not been as flexible and motivated to right his wrongs as he was, Casca could have been crisp pork by the end of the conviction arc, and not the guiding force for Guts' journey. Yes, Isidro's actions allowed the Black Swordsman to reunite with his beloved, but perhaps it would have been better for Casca if she hadn't been saved because... Casca versus the Beast of Darkness. Berserk is a story about many things, but one of the primary themes that Kentaro Miura wanted to express through his work was the idea of surrendering to one's inner beast of darkness. Every human being possesses the ability to commit heinous acts. It is one's morality and self-control that keeps their actions in check and their intentions mostly pure. Surviving an ordeal like the Eclipse would have made any normal man go crazy like Casca, but because Guts is Guts, he was able to retain his normal functionality. That is, for the most part. Ever since that infernal nocturnal feast, Guts' inner beast of darkness had started festering within him, and it compelled him to cast away everything in the pursuit of his vengeance, including Casca. There are two separate occasions on which the beast of darkness nearly took over Guts entirely, and spelled disaster for the branded girl. The first time was in Godot's cave. Guts brought some soup for Casca, and she ended up spilling it all over herself. He got her to strip because the soup was so hot that it would have legitimately burned her skin off, but once he did that, his lust overcame him. Guts cornered Casca, and was about to do what Griffith did to her before her cries knocked some sense into him, and made him hang his head in shame. He would get no such warning the second time it happened. After Casca defended herself from a gang of thugs, even in her broken Elaine state, Guts caught up with her, and was shocked to see her actually wielding a sword. He must have known that Casca killing her attackers was more primal instinct than conscious protection, but when he saw her in that naked and bloody state, his lust overcame him entirely. Guts pinned Casca down and nearly tore off a portion of her bosom, all the while being encouraged by his inner beast of darkness to violate and rip her apart. By the time he came to his senses, he realized that while he hadn't gone all the way like Femto had, he'd gone far enough. Casca had given up hope of being safe. You could see it in her eyes. Guts was disgusted by how far his own malice had driven him, and it was only after realizing that he needed other people to help him stay in check that he took on Isidro, Farnace, and Serpico as his traveling companions. For a very long time, Casca recoiled at the sight or touch of Guts because while her mind might not have been entirely there, it was present enough to register that assault. It's just one more tragedy for our female lead to work through in a way, but what makes it especially cutting is the fact that it was Guts who inflicted it upon her. The Black Swordsman was not the 100-man slayer Casca fell in love with, and that fact was not lost on her, even in her Elaine state. This incident isn't something she would be able to get over for the rest of the series, as you'll see in just a bit. That time, Casca was kidnapped by trolls. After all the things that have happened to her already, getting kidnapped by trolls seems like a small enough thing. But the trolls of Berserk are violently brutal astral beings who only care about feasting and fornicating. Their babies are born alien style, and once you consider that fact, then the idea of Casca getting kidnapped by them becomes far more appropriate for the context of this video. The trolls took Casca and Farnace, her caretaker, to the deepest region of the astral world known as Klipoff. There, they witnessed the reviling existence of a troll, and if Farnace had not brought Shirke's silver dagger along with her, there's no telling whether she and Casca would have joined the deceased ranks of countless women from Enoch Village. Following this instance, Casca was mostly kept out of harm's way thanks to Guts' group, whose main task became protecting her as he was out protecting them. Casca wouldn't face misfortunes as harrowing or life-altering as the ones we've described on this list until she reached Elfhelm, which was supposed to be a place that healed her mind, but ended up exposing the true extent of Casca's damaged mental and emotional state. Even after regaining her mind, Casca couldn't see the person she most wanted to see. The first thing that Guts' group did on Elfhelm after recuperating for a bit was go to the Corridor of Dreams and restore Casca's mind. Shirke and Farnace's journey through the dreamscape that represented the branded girl's fragmented psyche brought Berserk readers back to a time when the manga was all darkness all the time. In that dreamscape, Guts was represented as a one-eyed hound who was dragging a coffin containing the broken Casca inside of it through the landscape of the Eclipse. As Shirke and Farnace put together Casca's mind by reliving her memories and experiences leading up to the Eclipse, they realized that the final fragment keeping them stuck in that nightmare was the visage of the demon child, though neither of them knew about him. When Shirke moved to release the final fragment, she and Farnace ended up witnessing the mad feast that was the Eclipse, and for the first time, they truly understood why Casca was the way she was. But after releasing the final fragment from its thorny cell, Shirke and Farnace were given the last fragment of Casca's sanity, which was now cursed, and they realized it after it was too late. Shirke warned Farnace that if she chose to restore Casca's memory, then there was no guarantee her sanity wouldn't collapse again, given just how traumatic the Eclipse and everything before it and after it had been for her. Farney was now confident that her help would eventually allow Casca to see the one she wanted to see, aka Guts, but once again, her faith in herself was misplaced. When Casca saw Guts for the first time after having her mind restored, she immediately fell to her knees and let out a blood-curdling scream, because, to her mind, Guts was still tied to the Eclipse and its horrors. When she was faced with her former lover, Casca didn't see Guts, she saw the Black Swordsman surrounded by that hellscape where her comrades died. The fact that Guts had nearly assaulted her not too long ago also likely played a role in this association, because the Eclipse was the site of Casca's violation, and equating that with Guts succumbing to his beast of darkness would be easy for the mental state she was in at that given time. Even after recovering and trying to talk to him from behind a tree, Casca couldn't stand being in Guts' presence. She displayed classic symptoms of PTSD whenever a reminder of the Eclipse would pop up in her mind, and as a result, she was forced to stay away from the one person she wanted to see the most all this time. But Casca being unable to see Guts will seem like a triviality when the next chapter comes out towards the end of April, because she was kidnapped by her tormentor and brought to his massive castle. Ever since the conviction arc came to an end, Casca has been getting visits from a mysterious boy on every night of a full moon. This boy seemed to have an instinctive bond with Casca and would cling to her as if she were his mother, even in her broken state as Elaine. Of course, we as the audience know already that Casca's demon child was absorbed into the vessel for Femto's incarnation into the physical world, but literally no one else knows that. Well, no one else except for Casca, who figured out the Moonlight Boy's identity as being the child she created with Guts all those years ago. But as always, the realization came a bit too late and would have probably been best left alone. Just as Casca put two and two together and stepped out to get back her baby, she stopped dead in her tracks because the Moonlight Boy ended up transforming into Griffith in front of her very eyes. Casca's mind suffered a second mental break of sorts at the sight of the man who violated her and made her life hell for around 3 years. Her brand of sacrifice gushed blood like a geyser, and she passed out instantly, which is why she's in for the rudest awakening of her life when her eyes open next. Because while she was incapacitated, Griffith decided it would be a great idea to kidnap her and take her with him to Falconia. For Griffith, this was a very tactical move. No one knew of his transformations into the Moonlight Boy except Griffith himself, and if they did, they'd have been able to exploit his greatest weakness. Putting Casca in a location where he could always keep an eye on her only made sense for Griffith, but for her, it's akin to being thrown into the same jail that she had just escaped from. Casca doesn't know about Elfhelm's destruction, Danon's disappearance, or anything that unfolded in the aftermath of her second major breakdown. Right now, she is in the arms of her abuser, floating above the harbor of Falconia, with no clue as to where she is. Chapter 372 has been announced for the next Young Animal issue, so we won't have to wait too long to see how Griffith's kidnapping of Casca is going to play out, but we can tell you that things are going to get real intense real quick. Griffith will have a lot of explaining to do, not just to Sonia, but to Charlotte and the rest of Falconia if he wants to keep Casca by his side. And as for Casca herself, only Kujimori knows where her tale proceeds from this point. Though, if we had to make a guess, we'd say it was heading in a direction that would finally see Casca snap and go berserk. Marvelous verdict. And that's our list. Casca was introduced as a nagging character who was devoted to Griffith and wanted nothing to do with Guts, but over time, she has come to represent the heart and soul of Berserk. She is the only thing that kept the Black Swordsman tethered to his humanity, and now that she is no longer with him, literally no one can guess how much worse Guts' mental and emotional state is going to get. Casca is the reason why we have been chewing our nails since December 2022 in anticipation of a new chapter of Berserk, and thankfully, the wait is going to be shorter than we expected. Berserk 372 comes out on April 28th, and we can't wait to see how Studio Gaga carries forward its leading lady's terrible fate of tragedies. That's all for this one, but thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.